Thank you very much, and thank you again to WGBH for hosting today's forum. This is going to be a little bit of a pivot, as we've already suggested, from some of the more classroom-based activities that we've had a chance to hear about, and kind of what I would think of as sort of high-touch experiences to the science, informal science education environment, specifically planetariums, but trying to convey sort of lessons learned as the planetarium community has shifted from very traditional night sky, kind of astronomy-based education to data visualization, and some of the lessons that we've learned and what we can take from that to apply to some of the other topics that we're talking about today. So I'm actually going to start with a little bit of a personal history of planetariums, which actually turns out to recapitulate a bit of the history of planetariums themselves. I first went to a planetarium in Chicago, Illinois, the Adler Planetarium, which interestingly was actually the first planetarium in the United States. It opened in 1930. And when you walk inside, I went in a little after this picture was taken. You saw this, first of all, kind of monstrous machine in the center of the theater, and an environment in which you were kind of circled around that machine and as like campers around a fire, looking up at the night sky. And so in a sense, this is the first virtual reality machine. It just did one thing. It did the night sky. And it would replicate the motion of the sky, and you could move to different places on Earth. The sort of definitive history of planetariums is called theaters of time and space. But the limitations on that were rather evident. Now, I will note that my first experience actually involved a bit of terror because of the machine in the center of the theater, which is a generation beyond what you're seeing there. But also, I learned that the sun was not going to live forever. And so there's a sort of existential terror that accompanied that as well. And I kind of wonder if there's any lesson to be learned from that sort of experience of awe of something that's beyond you in terms of how we talk about some of the more climate and environmentally related issues. At any rate, this was my inspiration for going into astronomy. I pursued a degree in astronomy at Rice University in Houston. I started moonlighting at this institution, the Houston Museum of Natural Science. The planetarium is actually not visible. It's off to the left in this image. I started working there in the early 90s, and inside that theater, which interestingly from a historical perspective was built in the 1960s in the heyday of the space race when Earth and space sciences were top of mind at schools and at informal learning institutions. But inside there was this, can't see it too well in this image, this kind of monolithic digital projection system that projected the night sky and basically any dots and lines that you would want to project in the sky. It's vector graphics for those of you who are old enough to remember the original Asteroids game. It was that kind of representation of dots and lines that could cover the entire dome. What I think is amazing about this experience is that when I interviewed for the job, I was given a joystick that I could use to fly through the universe. And that's an interesting experience that changes the experience, the traditional experience of a planetarium, which is sort of this vault of heaven concept, a sort of vocabulary that we use all the time, which is really a complete misrepresentation of what's out there, into just a really large portal onto the universe. So being able to fly through space, that first experience, really transformed my idea of what could happen inside these environments. I eventually worked at the Rose Center for Earth and Space in the Hayden Planetarium. This planetarium opened in the year 2000 with a radically different perspective on what you could do in these environments. It used full motion video to cover the entire planetarium dome, but moreover, embedded in the design of the theater was a set of real-time software that would allow you to fly through the universe with a much greater fidelity than we were able to achieve with our technology from the 90s, and a lot more information. As you can see in this image that doesn't quite convey, I think, the power of the experience, this is a perspective just outside our solar system. You can see the inner planets sort of crowded toward the center, obscuring the label on the sun. The circles, blue circles, represent nearby exoplanetary systems. And it doesn't do justice to the experience because it's a static image. And what's impossible to convey in this environment is the experience of being inside one of these immersive venues. So first of all, the imagery is moving, so you have more information than you have in this static display. You're able to get perspective on the three-dimensional structures that you see in front of you. And moreover, because it covers almost your entire field of view, unlike the sort of relatively minuscule field of view that this image projected in front of you covers, you are inside the data. You're having an experience that is potentially truly transformative. We learned many lessons in depicting data about space in the years that we were exploring what we call the digital universe at the American Museum of Natural History. And some of those lessons, I think, apply very directly, as in the last several years, we've tried to apply those ideas to displaying more data about Earth itself. From the American Museum of Natural History, which is a very traditional natural history museum on the East Coast, I went to the California Academy of Sciences, a San Francisco institution that inhabits the largest green building in the world, open to the public, and yet has a 165-year-long history of natural history research and a shorter but still significant history in terms of presenting discoveries to the general public. If you were to land on the living roof of the institution, you would see in the distance over our piazza, we have an Italian architect, so we have a piazza, the living roof draped over the dome of the planetarium. And if you were to sink down inside, you would see the new Morrison planetarium. And so here, we've tried to take some of the ideas that we explored in the planetarium community as we introduced ourselves to data visualization, expanded our perspective from the night sky to the three-dimensional universe around us. And now, as we like to say at Morrison Planetarium, we want to put the planet back in planetarium. But let me backtrack once again and just really quickly give you a sense of the history of Morrison Planetarium, because we actually built our own star projector in San Francisco, because that's kind of the way San Francisco works, back in the 1950s. A design that was based, this is a beautiful illustration that was only recently rediscovered by Russell Porter. If you're an astronomy geek, this is the individual who designed effectively, in large part, the instruments at Palomar Observatory. He also, if you're a visualization geek, invented the cutaway view, which you can see in the lower middle of this drawing. But this was the first significant American-built star projector, and it, too, was an exercise in data visualization. Using the technology of the time, they calculated the locations of the 3,800 brightest stars, and then, again, this is data viz circa 1952, used those star positions to accurately position the stars on the physical plates that were used to project the sky. And this instrument was a phenomenal instrument for the time, but again, it did one trick, the night sky. We now have a much different perspective on technology. We use clusters of computers to drive real-time and playback systems. By that I mean, it's like the planetarium in one case in DVR mode, where we're showing a film that we've created, a digital film that we can reproduce to fill the entire dome. Or in real-time mode, it's more like Xbox, PS4 mode. We're using a real-time collection of data to drive the computers that show content on the in the immersive space of the planetarium. And even if you don't have a planetarium, I think we're going to see that the lessons we've learned in this environment are going to spill over into a lot of other areas as well. Because when we drive our planetarium dome in this immersive space, I think we're learning lessons that will apply also to, as I'll talk about a little bit at the end of the program, of the talk, virtual reality environments. But you have to look at a new way of telling stories in this space. When you look at video and you have a window onto a universe that maybe in a theater fill a significant portion of your field of view, or maybe in your home or on your iPhone fill a very small field of view, you can use devices that have been developed actually over more than a century of creating films and small screen content. But you don't have that luxury in this immersive space. A cut, a transition from one place to another very rapidly, is like being in an instantaneous transporter in Star Trek. Suddenly you go from being in one place to another. If you don't create a logical connection for people to understand that transition, you're going to lose them. And so it's driven us to a form of storytelling that I think of as a narrative journey. you're taking people places, traveling through space and time in order to tell a story. And when this succeeds, you have an experience that is intellectual, learning ideas, facts, perhaps, as you go on the trip, has also an emotional connection, so you're engaging the audience on an emotional level, but also a visceral connection, because it is an embodied experience. You're in this space that is traveling someplace. Your field of view is immersed. You are, for intents and not maybe all intents and purposes, for many intents and purposes, traveling in space. So we want to tell stories, craft these narrative journeys in a way that allow for the cognitive load of all of this experience, these intense visuals, the music, the soundtrack, some celebrity is talking to you and things are happening and visualizations are transpiring. We want to be able to give people the space to experience that and really take something away from that experience. And I'll also note that 600,000 people a year go through this environment. We don't have the opportunity for a high-touch experience, as again, like we've heard about already this morning. Instead, this is like the hook. This is the connection that people might make to then want to explore more deeply. And as I'll also talk about in a moment, we are looking at ways to share some of the work that we do that goes into these productions with classrooms, educators, and a broader audience. So, to give you a couple examples, these are some scenes from the very first show that we produced that opened the new California Academy of Sciences in 2008. This is just a scene of Saturn with the Cassini spacecraft flying by. This was actually rendered through our real-time system, so we could have almost as easily done, not quite as high quality a rendering, but basically done that in our real-time system. But all of the trajectories of the spacecraft are following the same, actually, spice kernels, as they're called, that determine the trajectory that the JPL scientists use to chart the locations of these objects. When we travel farther outside the solar system, we highlight the locations of extrasolar planets, the provocative idea of planets around other stars that could potentially have life. It's a framing device that we use a lot in the Academy because we are an institution that studies life sciences. Now, both of these scenes I presented as two disconnected, flat screen, small field of view experiences. In fact, the entire show was constructed along a single flight path that started at the Academy, traveled out to the Virgo cluster about 65 million light years away, and then came back to Earth. That opportunity, so that's the kind of didactic opportunity that these immersive environments allow you. This continuity and change of scale is an opportunity to really convey the connectedness of these different concepts. So we also, so now actually jumping back to an earlier moment in the show, spent a lot of time looking at Earth. Now, the scenes that I'm going to show, we're starting here over Madagascar, which is an area where the Academy does research. We're looking at a NOAA spacecraft that is used to observe Earth. And the message that we're really trying to get across is that we can now think of a digital Earth. We can think of Earth differently, kind of as a Earth from space trailer demonstrated, by viewing it from space. So we're seeing the orbit lines of the myriad satellites that NASA and NOAA use to observe Earth. And then we're highlighting, in this case, just one example of sea surface temperature. So this is fairly basic compared to some of the things that we've explored since then, but we're really trying to set the stage. First of all, there were a lot of planetarium goers who were a little annoyed that we spent so much time talking about Earth when they really just wanted to travel out into space. So it was kind of weighing a little bit of the expectations of our audiences and introducing them the idea of, again, putting the planet back in planetarium. This is, by the way, going to shift in a moment to showing carbon monoxide as a representation, but that's sort of not relevant to the larger issue, which is what we had to do in kind of a pre-rendered, create every frame of the program, store it on disk so that we can play it back for our audiences. Virtually all of these kind of data sets are available in some, at least, of the real-time software platforms that planetarians use. Now, in 2008, we were one of the only planetariums talking about Earth-oriented content. And now, more and more facilities, as they gain access to these tools, have an opportunity to tell these kinds of stories. And again, I think the real opportunity that we have is not just to show these kind of data representations that you can experience looking at a small screen. In fact, may be able to have a better experience in terms of interacting with it, but we can integrate those into a story. And moreover, we can integrate them through a sense of scale to connect a human scale to these larger regional and global phenomena. So for an example of that, I'm actually going to go to another show we produced called Earthquake, Evidence of a Restless Planet. We do live in San Francisco. It's only reasonable to do a show about earthquakes. But for that show, we wanted to highlight, in this case, we're showing 4 data sets, actually 2 related data sets. On the left-hand side, we're seeing a local earthquake simulation of the 1906 event, the Great San Francisco Earthquake. On the top, we're seeing surface shaking, shown in red. On the lower left, we're seeing slip along the fault plane. So basically, the 2 plates are moving against one another, creating the surface shaking that you see above. On the right-hand side, we're showing a related simulation at a global scale. On the top right, you're seeing surface shaking on this superimposed on a global map. On the lower right, you're seeing penetration of the seismic energy into Earth's mantle, and in fact, beautifully right there, reflecting off of Earth's core. Nice, but how do you integrate that into a scene that allows people to sort of connect these global phenomena to their own sort of experience of the Earth is shaking? So I'm actually going to turn this over to a video of myself talking, but I can't actually talk as fast as I do in this video, but this will just give you an idea of how we chose to do this. We started at the surface in San Francisco. This actually is all based on historical data that we have about this exact location of California market streets, but we wanted to connect this experience, this sort of visceral experience of seeing an earthquake in San Francisco to the concepts that we wanted to convey about plate tectonics and seismology.
The film was created for a 75-foot diameter 4K tilted dome using 6 video projectors blended seamlessly to create an immersive experience. The bottom of the fisheye corresponds to the front of the theater, while the top of the image lies behind the audience. A science-based recreation of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake begins with a street scene based on both historical and modern photography. Historical insurance maps provide critical information about construction materials that allow buildings to respond accurately to ground motion driven by supercomputer simulation data. Photo reference guides hand animation of buckling rails and slumping streets and sidewalks. Dynamic fracturing of individual buildings and falling and tumbling debris also follow historical evidence. Pulling away to a more stylized than diagrammatic appearance makes use of a procedurally created cityscape based on the known street grid. This shift also allows audiences to gain an emotional distance after the street-level visceral earthquake simulation. The animation of areas affected by fires erupting in the wake of the earthquake is based on historical data on how the fire spread. Custom software integrated high-resolution satellite and aerial geographic data into a generalized but flexible Earth rendering package. From a regional perspective, we recreate the event to address the underlying science. We begin with the supercomputer simulation showing slip along the San Andreas Fault, seen in yellow, as well as calculated surface shaking intensity, seen in red. Note that the fault plane rupture now subtends approximately 120 degrees of the audience's field of view. Moving farther beneath Earth's surface, we reveal a second supercomputer simulation showing the surface shaking on a global scale emanating from San Francisco. The same simulation provided data showing seismic wave propagation into Earth's mantle. The depiction of the mantle cross-section is colored based on temperature variation derived from tomographic analysis of seismic data. An additional data layer shows the location of tectonic plate boundaries projected onto Earth's surface.
So part of the idea behind that short piece is also to convey the level of effort that we put into maintaining the authenticity that our audiences expect from an institution like the California Academy of Sciences. And that's an important component of all the work we do. And I'll have one other illustration of that, of how we try to take natural history museums into the 21st century with this kind of program with Habitat Earth. So having introduced our audiences to a digital Earth in our first show and having then shown them a show about earthquakes in which the only star that appears is the sun, we figured we had sufficiently weaned them to really talk about environmental topics, and Habitat Earth is a chance for us to really describe ecosystems. So for this program, this is just one kind of example. We started at one point in the show, kind of in the middle of the show, swimming with salmon in a river, the Eel River in Northern California. And then we lift up to show the river in the context of kind of an aerial view, which would be familiar to sort of anyone who's flown in an airplane. And then continue that liftoff to show the connection of rivers in which salmon spawn in the North Pacific, and then on up to really cover the entire North Pacific and the areas that are enriched by salmon, which actually transport energy from the ocean into the interior of the continent. So this is all done in about 2 minutes of the show, but it's done continuously. So you start at the scale of something you've probably eaten, and then travel through a perspective that might be familiar to you to this global perspective. And this kind of connectivity, I think, is a real opportunity with these kinds of environments. In a subsequent scene, I actually heard a couple ahs, which is awesome because that's exactly why these sea otters are here. Again, we're mammals. We like mammals. We identify with these creatures. And how can we tell a story about the role that sea otters play in their kelp forest ecosystem? Well, first we had to make the otters. And this is a little bit of a digression, but we actually have, these are purely digital otters. They're really like academy otters. So this is sort of a digital taxidermy experience here. We actually started with scans of the of sea otter specimens from the Academy's collection. We have 45 million specimens, so got to make use of them. And then actually did a three-dimensional scan of the sea otter's skull, which became the basis of wrapping the sea otter in musculature and then articulating the skull and the skeleton. So this allowed us to recreate the appropriate species of sea otter. And then actually scanned pelts from the museum's collection in order to then texture the sea otters appropriately. So it shows a comparison of the original sort of stand-in texture with the refined texture. And then ultimately we end up with, and then also studying sea otter behavior, we actually went down and shot some footage in Tomales Bay, and were able to look at how the sea otters moved. And then our animator took all of these elements, brought them together, integrating them, by the way, into an actual location where the Academy's aquarium's divers dive near Point Lobos, into this environment to talk about the relationship of the sea otters in terms of maintaining a smaller sea urchin population that prevents kelp forests from being consumed by, kelps from being detached from the floor by sea urchins. But just one other note, we also then were able in this photoreal environment to insert diagrammatic elements that then connected the specimens that were there, our digital live specimens that we're seeing in the environment, into a food web to talk about the relationships between the different animals and plants in this environment. Now, what's interesting is that, in a sense, natural history museums have been doing things like this for more than a century with dioramas and physical taxidermy, but by placing viewers inside the environment and then connecting concepts that would not be readily manageable in a physical diorama, we're able to really leverage this visceral experience of seeing these creatures with the more didactic experience of connecting them to the bigger concepts. To highlight one other sequence in the show, this shows this is an actual scene from the show cropped to HD, where we're talking about bird migration, in this case ospreys and turkey vultures, from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. Now, there's a lot going on in this shot. We're seeing the Earth colored by net primary productivity. We're fast forwarding through time in order to see the temporal change in net primary productivity, and then the way that the different species follow that productivity from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere and back. And in the story of the show, that's a relatively straightforward point that we wanted to make. But we also wanted to provide an opportunity for students and educators to make use of these data that we worked so hard to interpret for the show. So we created some assets that we are making available online. And the idea here, and with accompanying activities and curriculum support, but here we're now flattening out that map, allowing you to see as you witness change over time. And actually there's a separate little unit that talks about the net primary productivity, which we describe here as carbon absorption. And then be able to sort of scrub back and forth, look at the migration patterns and how the migration patterns track to the changing productivity on land. And I think this corresponds to the sort of working with data component of NGSS, but that's not my background. We have a great staff of educators who work with instructors to be able to figure out how to use these assets in the classroom and elsewhere. So I'll just mention briefly that is Habitat Earth in the Classroom. If you Google that, you'll end up right on the page. We actually have, for educators, a free version of the show as an HD version of the show that you can use in the classroom. So the idea is that we've built up these assets to create our shows, but we also, as I mentioned, you've got the DVR mode and the PS3, PS4 mode in the planetarium. This is a scene from our show where we talk about land use change over the past 10,000 years, but we have our current executive director who's looked at agricultural impact in the world, has also done live programs in the planetarium. So just as a quick example, this is from our real-time software. And again, being able to migrate these data into our real-time environment allows us to sort of create more quick and dirty interpretations of these concepts and try them out with audiences. This is looking at water use of agriculture around the globe, superimposed on the Earth at night imagery. The bright blue regions are regions that are using more water, and you can see things like Israel being a much more effective user of water than, for example, India. Another data set that we showcased was yield variation across Earth. So the regions that are colored are regions that are land that has already been converted to use for agriculture. And the question is, how do we use that land most effectively? The bright orange areas are regions where the gap between potential yield and actual yield is largest. So these are areas where we can potentially make an investment of not converting more land to use for agriculture, but instead focus on increasing the productivity of the land that has already been converted for agricultural use. So those are both snapshots from an evening program that we do at the Academy called Earth Update, where we bring our researchers into the dome and have them talk about their work to audiences. What's great is that's a chance for us to try out ideas with an audience that's very amenable to experimentation. It's part of our Cocktails and Science nightlife program, so as the evening goes on, they become more and more amenable to experimentation. And it's a great chance for us to see what we can do with these different data sets. And finally, I think the real connection then that this makes that I mentioned earlier may have arrived with your copy of the New York Times yesterday. This is my copy that arrived at my home. Unfortunately, I wasn't there to receive it. Luckily, my partner went to art school and was happy to come up with a visualization that actually also depicts the California Academy of Sciences mug in the background. But this very low-cost VR experience is something that's going to become more and more accessible to people. And I think the New York Times has just kind of blown it out of the water with this. Unfortunately, I didn't get my cardboard, so I could only experience it looking at the phone, but it's a very interesting example of how storytelling has to adapt to this new technology. We happen to use something called Gear VR. I actually have it in my bag if anyone wants to play around with it during a break. But the shows that we create can actually be directly transferred to this medium. But I think most importantly, the lessons we've learned in how to tell a story and interact with data in the immersive medium, the planetarium, can convert to this technology. And so with this technology, you can go anywhere. We can take Ken, who actually animated the otter that you saw earlier, down to the kelp forest. We can take him to the microscopic scale, surrounded by phytoplankton, and we can even take him inside three-dimensional abstract data sets that we've used to illustrate different concepts. The potential of this medium is exciting, but we also really have to figure out how to use it effectively. And I hope that some of the lessons that we've learned in the planetarium world can translate to that. So thanks very much for your kind attention. Look forward to talking more through the course of the day.
Ryan, if you'd join me over here. So I was home to get my New York Times yesterday with this strange box in it that we figured out how to put together. And my husband and I watched the video and, oh, look, you can look around. And it's a little strange at times that the text was over there and you had to whip your head around to find the text that nobody told you was going to appear in weird places. And then we went off into kind of a conversation about the use of virtual reality in science and visualizing molecules and visualizing universes. And meanwhile, my kids grabbed the VR headset. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is kind of emotionally challenging content. It's about displaced kids. But OK, this is an opportunity to connect with kids around the world. Let's see how they react to it. And my kids are definitely digital natives, but don't get as much screen time as they would like. So I was wondering how they were going to react to this. My 8-year-old put it on. This is awesome, Mama. You can even look up and down and everywhere, and this is great. My 6-year-old put it on, and he was so enthralled with the fact that you could look around that he started spinning in a circle, and I had to stop him before he made himself so dizzy he was going to fall down. And then my 3-year-old put it on. And he's walking around the kitchen with his hands clamped over his face to hold it on his face because it doesn't really fit him. And there's a ladder at one point in the video, and he's doing this. And my husband and I aren't sure whether to laugh or cry.
It's an embodied experience.
It's an embodied experience, but it's still not the real world. And I think this really gets at some of the tension around the use of these technologies in education and with kids. How do we use the power, utilize these technologies to their full power to understand our world and bring us more deeply into the world without actually pulling us away from the real world?
Absolutely, and I work at an institution that has the Natural History Museum collections. It also has an aquarium. There are living creatures in the same building where we're doing our shows, and you can't compete with penguins. There's a real-world experience of, we have a gorgeous coral reef tank where you're looking at a 2.5-story tall coral reef, face-to-face with all the fish. It's a recreation of a coral reef in the Philippines. These real-world experiences are absolutely critical, and we're living creatures. We want to have those experiences, and it's about, I think, providing the opportunity to have those experiences. The digital experiences, and the way I frame what we try to accomplish in the visualization studio at the Academy, is to provide experiences that you can't have face-to-face with the penguins or the coral reef. So how do you provide a perspective on a diorama with a species in Africa, wherever Africa is, that was shot and killed, frankly, back in the 30s? And how do you connect that to what's happening in Africa today? How do you connect that to the global issues that are confronting maybe that same species, if it's not extinct, today? And those are where I think there are opportunities for digital media to enhance the Science Museum experience, and that's where we've really tried to focus our energies.
I loved your comment at the beginning about the transformational experience of driving the show as opposed to experiencing the show. And we know from plenty of research that the difference between watching something on a screen versus interactively driving it is very different. Our brain reacts to it very differently. How do we give more students and more people that opportunity to be in the driver's seat?
Well, we've done it on a small scale at the Academy with classroom groups and camp groups that have created their own planetarium shows that we've shown in a little inflatable dome. The American Museum of Natural History is actually doing something similar. And so for that smaller scale, I think that we're kind of learning what's required to ease that introduction into these new ways of interacting with data and visualizing data. But I do think that, whether it's the VR headset or some other online interactive, I think that that's where we can at least provide the opportunity to interact with data in a way that's really unprecedented. the big challenge I see is really creating the visualizations of the data that are really accessible and manageable by a broad swath of audiences. We tend to encode our visualizations in ways that are often incomprehensible or very familiar to someone who's science literate or who's learned that the rainbow color palette means something from their education. But I think that one of the challenges we have to look at, aside from the interactivity, is how we present data in a way that people can really understand.
I heard a story on NPR the other day about a data visualization center being built in, I think it was London, in the UK, and a controversy over whether it was really worth the money necessary to create this center, the goal of which was to have scientists be able to come in as necessary to visualize their data in this full dome immersive kind of experience. In the education realm, that makes me wonder if we're creating a new version of haves and have-nots. The cost associated with this kind of technology is so high. How do we address that without leaving a lot of people behind?
It's clearly a challenge. What I do think is interesting, I mean, the Morrison Planetarium is a 75-foot diameter dome with a ridiculous amount of technology in it. But there are portable planetariums that you take a single fisheye lens projector into and it inflates in a high school gymnasium or wherever, and you can actually invite students in to have a much more intimate and potentially actually much more transformative experience in certain ways than we can do in these large immersive environments. I mean, the VR technology is at least more affordable than a planetarium, but I think there are more and more options available, and we can only hope that we can find mechanisms to get them to audiences that can make good use of them. There is a great example in the planetarium world. Unfortunately, it's the only one I know of, but of a committed planetarian who had been in the Peace Corps and frequently traveled back to Africa building a planetarium and basically scrounging together enough money to buy cinder blocks to build the basic environment, and then getting donations from planetarium companies to build that environment. But it's set up so it can actually link to New York or to whomever is running the same software, so you can actually have conversations taking place in a small planetarium in Ghana to New York or whatever other interested facility, and it's a two-way conversation. It's not, I think what's really remarkable about it is that it's not so much about the haves pushing information to the have-nots, in that case, if you will, but rather the dialogue that then develops between the two places.
I wonder if you could respond to both parents and educators like myself who are hesitant about the incorporation of technology into children's lives. We know from science that our brains react differently to a hands-on experience versus a book versus a screen. We don't necessarily know if those differences are good or bad. How do you respond to that hesitance and the power that technology could have in education?
I think any use of technology, I mean, first of all, technology is not a panacea. It's not a solution per se. It's a tool, and it's part of a broad swath of tools. I mean, I grew up reading books, and I still like books because they're a continuous narrative experience that takes you, whether it's a fictional space or a nonfiction argument. It's a tremendously powerful technology, but it is technology. We didn't have books 10,000 years ago, certainly. We barely had books.
And there was pushback against books when they first became a widespread technology.
You beat me to my point. So, I mean, you think about it, vowels were technological innovation, and we use vowels now. So, writing, very helpful. And so, the world changes, and, if you're, I mean, my parents would say, you're spending too much time reading your book, go outside and play. And I did, reluctantly, often, but it's creating that balance. And to point to technology as necessarily good or bad, it's maybe not the kind of conversation we should have. It's really about what's the appropriate sort of mix. For example, a 3-year-old probably should not continue to use the VR device for too long because we do know that that's probably not good. So.